Okay, American democracy was founded of an extraordinary energy. It was an extraordinary repudiation of what was at that time called the ancient regime. And the ancient regime we all learned about when we were children. It was the idea that a monarch, and they called it the divine right of kings, that your king or your queen was given by God the power to rule over the country. And then the king or queen had their cronies, their friends, and it was called the aristocracy. And so the basic system of government was that the king, the queen, and their cronies, the aristocracy, pretty much took whatever they wanted of the material resources of the country. And then whatever was left, whatever scraps were left on the floor, everybody else could have. And they wanted the rest of the people, who were basically serfs, to have enough to keep working for them. Well, this country was founded on an extraordinary repudiation of that idea. It was born of the Enlightenment philosophy of that period of time. It was radical then, and it's radical today. And it's the idea that power to govern a nation would be placed not in the hands of a king or a queen, not in the hands of their few cronies, but rather in the hands of the people. And the reason that universal education was important, according to Thomas Jefferson, was because if we do not have educated critical thought processes, we will not have what it takes intellectually to make the major decisions about our country. And a universal press was considered, a free press was also considered very important, so that we would have the information necessary to make those decisions as well. So the idea of a free press and universal education was considered essential to the governance of a democratic society. Now, we understand that most of the signers, or at least many of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, were themselves slave owners. And we know that Jefferson himself, for instance. We also know that they really only meant white men. We understand all that. We don't look to these people with tremendous respect, or perhaps any respect at all for many of them, in terms of what they rose above in terms of their own historical circumstances. But we respect the extraordinary, and we are grateful for, the extraordinary principles that are encoded in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, America has always been, from our very earliest beginnings, a contest, a dichotomy, between these extraordinary enlightened principles and historical circumstances which seem to actually mitigate against those principles. That contest has always been there. We, on one hand, were formed on these enlightened principles, but on the other hand, they're out of the genocide of the Native American peoples. They're formed on these extraordinary enlightened principles, and yet there were slaves. Extraordinary enlightened principles, and yet women had no rights, and so forth. But the important narrative, I think, of American history is not just the contest, that there has always been this dichotomy. The importance of American history is that, and you know, Winston Churchill once said, Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing after having exhausted every other option. So even though we have been profound transgressors of our own principles on which we purport to stand, important to the conversation today is that historically we have always tended to self-correct. So we had slaves, we abolished slavery. Women did not have right to vote, we passed the 19th Amendment. Blacks in the South did not have civil rights, we passed civil rights legislation. Now in our generation, yours and mine, we once again are enacting that same historical drama. And like in every other generation, there are those who seek to manifest more fully the democratic principles on which we purport to stand, whether it has to do with gay marriage or anything else. And there are those forces who would wish to take the major resources and powers of the country and withdraw them from the effort to manifest our highest ideals. And today is no different. Today, I believe, we have recreated an aristocratic condition. Once again, we have a small group of people who, for whatever reason, believe they're entitled, and a government which serves the process by which a majority of the resources, the material resources of the country, have been, over the last few decades, siphoned off into the hands of a very few. This has not happened through some mystery. It has happened through very specific policies. They have had to do with banking policies, they have had to do with taxation policies, and they have had to do with trade policies. Now the problem, and the reason Citizens United is so important, is that this was able to occur. The reason this occurred was because those forces had disproportionate power, disproportionate political influence than that wielded by the average citizen. Once again, not what this country is supposed to be. And so particularly, even though this has been happening now ever since about 1980, and it's just been a constant accumulation of policies by which these material resources have been siphoned off into the hands of a relative few, to the point where you have today 1% of Americans controlling 38% of the wealth. You have 60% of Americans controlling 2.3% of the wealth. And so what we have in America today is a kind of citizen lockout, by which the average American is more and more locked out politically, locked out educationally, and locked out economically. Locked out economically in the way that I just said, when you have that much wealth concentrated in the hands of a very few. And Louis Brandeis, the late Supreme Court Justice, said you can either have large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a very few, or you can have democracy, you cannot have both. Because when you have so much wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, what you have is that new aristocracy. You have, some people call it oligarchy, plutocracy, corporatocracy, or whatever. How are they locked out educationally? I don't need to tell anybody in this room how you're locked out educationally. Look at all the American young people who come out of college with an average of $30,000 worth of loans. What does this mean when you have generation after generation of people who do not have the economic means to have the quality education? That means only the rich get to be fully educated. These things have cumulative effects year after year. Also, I want to talk to you for just a moment about preschool and universal preschool. You might have heard some conversation about universal preschool because it's up for a lot of people today. Well, you might hear this, it goes past you. President Obama mentioned it in his last State of the Union. But a lot of people don't realize why universal preschool is so important. So give me a moment because I want to talk about why. If you can afford it in America and you have a little one, you send your little one to preschool. Okay. If you cannot afford it in America, you are less likely to send your child to preschool. Okay, now let's talk about what this means. That means if you did not go to preschool, you were behind on day one of kindergarten. Talk about some childhood trauma here, right? So you walk into kindergarten, it's your first day at school, and there are other kids in the class who are playing with these shapes called numbers and letters, but you don't know anything about them. So you were behind on day one. Ladies and gentlemen, we have 2 years to catch that child up. And if we do not catch up that child in their reading skill within 2 years, by the second grade, if they have not caught up, are you ready for this? Drum roll, they are then statistically on a 50% probability rate to incarceration. If we do not catch them up within 2 years after that, 4th grade, you can actually see a direct correlation between how many prison beds are built and how many American children cannot read in the 4th grade. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world, higher mass incarceration rate than China, Iran, Russia. We have 2.4 million people in prison in the United States today. During the 1970s, we had 300,000. 500,000 of those are nonviolent drug offenders. For an African-American man in America today, an African-American man in America today stands a 1 in 3 lifetime probability of incarceration. We have the second highest child poverty rate in the world. Of all industrialized nations, we are second only to Romania. 1 in 5 American children live in poverty. 1 in 5 American children are what's called food insecure. They say food insecure now rather than hungry. Why? Because a lot of these obese children are actually, obese children are actually malnourished. You might have read about these reports that when it comes to our international competition of education, what an educational failure we are in the United States. Well, let's look at this more clearly. Behind those educational statistics are economic statistics. Because if you're white and you're privileged enough in America today, you're getting a really fine education in our public schools. Absolutely up there competing with other countries. The reason our statistics are so low, the reason those educational, why America is 17th in this and 49th in that and so forth, is because of all of the students going to public schools in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. And you tell me, if you didn't know how to read, would you stay in school? I mean, if you're in the 6th grade or the 7th grade, and everybody else can read in your class and you can't, would you stay there? So I believe that, Martin Luther King said that the American people are far more compassionate than the U.S. government. I think that the American people, first of all, I think that there's a lot of rumbling. I think a lot of people are understandably outraged. And you know, when Christina mentioned about anger, I think there's a difference between anger and moral outrage. People were outraged by slavery, and they should be outraged by slavery. They were outraged at the fact that women didn't have a right to vote, and they should be. Actually, moral outrage, even anger to some extent, is not what concerns me nearly as much as the complacency that you see in way too many Americans who are numb to what's going on around us. And ladies and gentlemen, whether it's pharmaceutically induced or any other way, this is not a time in America to be numb. This is not the time in America to be distracted. This is not a time in America to be even cynical, because cynicism is just an excuse for not helping. And as Christina mentioned, now with the Citizens United case, and I'm among those who thinks that our Supreme Court at this point in our history has quite a few political hacks on it. So what we've got now is the Citizens United case, which Christina has mentioned, where moneyed interests, whether it's corporate or individual or union, are able to give on an anonymous basis and on an unlimited basis money into the advertising campaigns that are sure to either elect or to defeat a candidate. And I want to tell you something. I don't know how up on this you are, Christina. There's another one that's going to be coming down the pipe. Coming up the pipe. What do you call it? Down the pipe? That's the McCutcheon case. And if the McCutcheon case goes a certain way, and there's every reason with this Supreme Court to believe it will, it would also take the cap off individual donation. Right now, the most that any individual can donate to a political campaign is $2,600. So, you know, I come from a generation where it was a countercultural time in the 60s and the 70s. I think a big difference between those of you who are in college now versus the times when I was in college was the fact that there was a draft. This was right in front of us, because it was every young man in this room was facing the lottery, was facing the issue of what your draft number was. And so the good thing about that was that there was no way to be distracted from what was going on while the Vietnam War was raging. And that generation, there's been a lot of revisionism about that generation, like we were just a bunch of hippies while we sat around and, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I'm here to tell you that that was just during the day. Just some hours. And we stopped the war, and we brought down a president. And to some of you, what have you done? So what we have today, at that time there was one war, and what you have today is a permanent war economy. We have a permanent war machine now. Some people would suggest that in a way it's worse. And how do these things change? How was slavery abolished? As JFK said, things don't just happen, things are made to happen. You know, I've been reading, I'm on my second novel right now, which happens to be talking about the abolitionist movement and the psychology of the abolitionists. Just serendipitously that I've read two in a row. One, a marvelous book about the Grimke sisters, who were actually historical figures. You'd probably find them very interesting, Christina. There were two sisters who were born into a well-to-do slave-owning family in Charleston, South Carolina. And the book is so fascinating because it really goes into the psychological process by which people awaken. You know, that a long time before there was an abolitionist movement in a political sense, there was a very long period of time, because individuals, you know, groups go through the same kind of developmental processes that an individual goes through. First you hear about it, then you think about it, then you have to really integrate it into your understanding, then you have to face the kind of fear of what it means, then you have to integrate what it would mean if you actually stood up for it and what you might be sacrificing or having to lose. You know, there's a lot you go through before you stand up and say, no, 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 no. And there was a lot of that kind of processing. They had to go on inside the minds and hearts of many, many people before it turned into the abolitionist movement. Same with before it turned into the women's suffragette movement. Same with what had to happen before the civil rights movement. For that matter, all that had to happen before there was a war for independence in the United States. So as a woman, you know, women, particularly women who have been pregnant, but even women who have not been pregnant, understand viscerally this idea that you're pregnant with something before it emerges. And society sometimes is pregnant with something before it emerges. We're gestating. It's inside. It's growing. And then it will be time for it to be born into the world. Well, we're living at a time, I believe, where America has once again, as we have before, swerved from our own ethical center. We now have a very unholy alliance of American power with a capitalism. You know, I'm a capitalist, and I'm a passionate capitalist, and capitalism has been very good to me. I've written quite a few books, and people have bought them. So I'm not someone who doesn't celebrate capitalism, and I'm not someone who doesn't celebrate wealth creation. That's not the problem here. It's that capitalism has swerved from its ethical center. Adam Smith, who was the basic architect of free market capitalism, said free market capitalism cannot exist outside an ethical center. And our government, one of the first principles of the United States, is that our government is meant to be a balancing. A government is meant to be a balancing agent between individual freedom, including economic freedom, and the care for the common good. And today, in far too many cases, instead of our government being that which advocates for the people against the excesses of economic forces, is way too often advocating for the economic forces, even at the expense of the basic rights of the American people. Why? Because we have now developed this system of legalized bribery, where for the vast majority of political candidates and people in power, in order to get into office and to stay into office, they need that corporate money. Well, ladies and gentlemen, don't expect either of them to fix it. To expect the political status quo to fix it is like saying, surely the thief will bring my things back. Maybe yes and maybe no. Abolition did not grow out of a major political party. Women's suffrage did not grow out of a major political party. The civil rights movement did not grow out of a major political party. The kinds of social justice movements that really form the narrative by which America self-corrects when we self-correct is always because of what happens in an uprising among the citizens of the United States. That's, for instance, in my campaign, why I'm running as an independent. I've been a Democrat all my life. If I were to win, as you heard me say in that video, I would caucus with the Democrats. But at this time in our history, I feel very strongly that the two major political parties have a chokehold on our political system, which is sucking the oxygen out of our public discourse. It's almost like you sit down somewhere, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, that ends the conversation. It's like we're all filtering our ideas or our beliefs through what you're supposed to say if you're a Democrat, or you're supposed to say if you're a Republican. At this point, I'm not sure I want to hear any more what the Republicans have to say. I'm not sure I want to hear that much what the Democrats have to say. I want to hear what we have to say.
That's right.
That's what's so exciting about this. Abraham Lincoln said there's not that much evil any one government can perpetrate as long as the American people remain vigilant. And he was referring to the fact that the House of Representatives are elected every 2 years. We have some very serious problems, ladies and gentlemen. We have the president pushing something called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is nothing less than a multinational corporate coup. We have the National Defense Authorization Act. We have the NSA surveillance. And at this point, these horrible things, there's so many things that make you go, now, I can't believe this is happening. Can you believe this? Can you believe this? When I was growing up, it was like, well, don't worry too much about it, because it's so unconstitutional, it'll never stand. These days, it is becoming less and less reasonable to assume that these things will be handled. So this is your future. This is my future. Statistically, my future will not be as long as your future. But you know what? These things don't stand if you and I wake up and if you and I take action. And that's why I'm happy to be here, because there is nothing more powerful than Americans when we wake up. Thank you.